Starting from the 1960s, the Republic of Korea was the scene of one of the most dramatic transformations any nation has ever experienced. After 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, a bloody civil war that marked the first clash of the Cold War, and a brief democratic interregnum, commonly known as South Korea, it would begin the transition from underdevelopment to prosperity, moving from an agricultural economy to an industrialized and technologically innovative economy. The architect of this process has a name, Park Chung-Hee, a figure who to this day sparks the most heated debates among his compatriots. Depending on who judges him, was he a modernizer and a great statesman, or rather a ruthless man in his ambitions who built an autocratic regime? The truth is that when he seized power through a coup d'etat in 1961, South Korea was a poor and isolated country, even more so than its red neighbor to the north. But after his term ended, its gross domestic product per capita would rise by more than 2,000%. Exports multiplied by 100, and the average annual growth was over 9%. In defiance of prevailing economic theories, the series of measures implemented by President Park Chung-Hee were marked by strong state centralization and the imposition of military discipline. Its result is the so-called miracle on the Han River, and it forms the basis of the success of the peninsular nation. Today, it stands as the world's 10th largest economy, after having climbed from the 180th position. Today, we are going to present to you this story, which serves as a reference for the present. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow us on our Instagram account, which you can find below this video. Born in November 1917 in the city of Gumi, Park Chung-Hee was the seventh child of a humble farming family. As a young man, he worked for a short period as a teacher before enrolling in the Xinjiang Officer School to join the army, special from Manchukuo, the state of Manchuria, which was a puppet state of Japan, located in Japanese-occupied China. Ambitious and determined, at that time he had Napoleon as his hero. Would he discover his true calling in the military world after a rather mediocre performance in the academic field? After graduating in 1942 as an officer, as the top of his class, he moved to Tokyo to join the Japanese Military Academy, from which he graduated in 1944. It was during this period that he met most of his fellow conspirators in the 1961 coup. He received a classical Japanese martial education and developed a strong affinity for Japanese culture. That is, a kind of love for everything that Japan represents, characterized by his admiration for the Restoration, Meiji, which was the regime under which Japan had opened up to Western influence. Toward the end of World War II, Park is sent to the 8th Manchurian Infantry Corps as a second lieutenant. When Korea is liberated from the Japanese, he travels to Beijing, where hundreds of his compatriots form the Korean Liberation Army. In 1946, he joins the second class of the new Korean Military Academy. 2 years later, a decisive moment would occur in his life. A harsh uprising shakes Korea in rejection of the state partition agreed upon by the United States and the Soviet Union. The uprising is suppressed, leaving tens of thousands dead. Inhabitants of Jeju Island, spurred on by the pro-communist Workers' Party, which Park himself supported, declare a general strike. In the midst of the government's campaign of repression to contain the subversion, numerous military personnel are purged, and the name Park Chung-Hee appears connected to a leftist cell, although the specific connection to that cell is never proven. In the midst of all these events, Park Chung-Hee is sentenced to death, a sentence that is later reduced to 20 years in prison. For reasons that are difficult to determine, although it is suggested that his superiors held him in high regard and intervened on his behalf. Park is eventually released in exchange for exposing some of the clandestine activities of the Labor Party. Shortly after, he assumes as a civilian a position as Director of Intelligence and Operations at Army Headquarters. Park would always deny any inappropriate association. But because of what happened, both internally and in the eyes of their international allies, he would have to prove with particular vehemence that he was a reliable man in the fight against communism. With the outbreak of the Korean War in 1951, of the bloodiest conflicts in history where they faced off, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, supported by the United States and other countries, against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union, Park Chung-Hee is reinstated in the army. Surprisingly, he is appointed major only 14 months after being detained. For his bravery on the battlefield, he receives the Order of Merit 3 times. In the years 1950, 1951, and 1953, he stands out among the officers of the Western-backed side. His party history is set aside, and within the limits of his age, he is promoted to the rank of colonel. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the Korean Army was divided into 3 major groups based on the regional origin of its members: the Northeast Group, the Northwest Group, and the Central South Group. Within these groups, there were also subdivisions based on military academies. Park, although he was originally from the South, maintained very good relations with the leaders from the Northeast, since they had been his companions in Shinhin. The union of officers from this region with those from the South added to the contacts that Park had forged during his time in intelligence. It would become the central block of the coup efforts. The idea of a conspiracy had been brewing in his mind since 1956, when Syngman Rhee committed fraud to get himself re-elected as president. However, it wouldn't be until 1960 that he finally convinced himself to take the path of armed struggle. In that year, the students took the initiative for regime change ahead of the military in response to a second fraud by Syngman Rhee. The streets were taken over and the government's response was swift. 183 protesters are killed in a single day. Faced with pressure from the Liberal Party, Syngman Rhee resigns and goes into exile in Hawaii. The Second Republic is established under the government of Chang-myung, who, although elected prime minister through a democratic process, quickly degenerates into corruption and inefficiency. The climate of social discontent is widespread. In general terms, this is the context in which 3,000 officers take the city of Seoul. Once the irreversibility of the coup, led among others by Park Chung-Hee, was demonstrated, they face the problem of legitimacy. Park seeks 2 sources of support, that of the sitting president and that of the United States government through the Secretary of State. To win popular support, he bets on attracting the masses through strong economic performance. The newly formed government junta seeks to send a clear message by issuing a statement of intentions consisting of 6 points. Among them were respect for the United Nations Charter, opposition to communism, and the commitment to transfer power to competent politicians. Within a reasonable period of time, the government junta, with the Soviet bloc and even with the non-aligned countries, in favor of continuing and deepening collaboration with the United States. It should be kept in mind that South Korea was the largest beneficiary of external aid from the Americans. But this was mostly concentrated in consumer goods and military assistance. Despite this, and in the midst of pressing needs, Park always thought long-term. This is reflected in the following phrase, open quotes, "What Korea needs is not sacks of sugar, but bricks to rise," close quotes. His great challenge was to obtain resources to boost seriously neglected areas, and for this purpose, he always preferred loans managed by his government over direct investments from foreign companies. True to his nationalist instincts, he believed that this strategy allowed him to give up less sovereignty. The military acts guided by the purpose of industrializing South Korea, In his view, the post-war democratic experiment had failed to create a viable nation. It generated not only poor material results, but also a spiritual degradation with a cult towards foreign things. In his memoirs called The Country, the Revolution, and I, Park states that it was not until he came to power that he was able to see just how bad the Korean economic situation really was. Drastic measures were taken to undertake the long-awaited industrialization. More than 50 of the main owners of chaebols, which are a type of family-owned business conglomerate, are imprisoned on charges of illicit enrichment, which included everything from the discretionary allocation of public contracts to excessive profit margins. The fear was so great that the owner of Samsung, who had escaped arrest only because he was traveling in Tokyo, offered to donate his entire fortune to the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. Both he and the rest of the major businessmen were tasked, through force and intimidation, with developing the country's productive capacities. And over time, they would become part of the four actors that served as pillars of the new regime, along with the state, the technocrats, and the small landowners. Already in the first year, Park established himself as the undisputed leader. By purging several of the coup leaders, including General Chun Do-yong, his chief of staff and the man who had helped him rise militarily in his youth. Under pressure from the Kennedy administration and in fulfillment of the junta's promises, elections were held in 1963. After many conflicts, the civilian opposition comes together as a united bloc. Despite this, Park, who had faced internal pressure not to run as a candidate, is declared the winner by just over 1 percentage point. The closely contested race was widely considered to be clean. It is from this point on that he is able to fully develop his vision of a rich nation and a strong army, which essentially amounted to a combination of state dirigism with the Japanese ethos. For him, economic growth and national security were inseparable matters, since the possibility of an invasion from the north was always present. Amid still lukewarm relations with the United States, General Park travels to West Germany. There, he secures urgent financing in exchange for sending workers such as miners and nurses. Park is very impressed with the German highway system and sets out to replicate it in the interconnections of cities like Seoul. It is not until 1964, with Lyndon Johnson in the White House, that relations with the United States really take shape. Starting from the agreement to deploy thousands of South Korean troops in the Vietnam War. Since then, the North American superpower would serve as a brake on its more radical aspirations. Beyond all his merits, it should be noted that the South Korean leader benefited from a favorable global context during the more institutional stage of his term. The general agreement on tariffs and trade eliminated most of the trade barriers in developed countries, favoring the import of products. There was also a boom in commercial banks, which were key in obtaining loans for countries undergoing industrialization. As if that weren't enough, the Japanese, with whom relations would be normalized in 1965, were granting technology licenses under the Flying Geese model, the division of labor in East Asia. Park Yong-il concentrated power in the executive, looking down on democratic processes with their slow and complicated legislative procedures. In his view, South Koreans should limit themselves to copying the Western democratic form without trying to transplant its content. This was put into practice from the beginning, but it was from 1972 onwards that it took a classic authoritarian turn. He filled a third of the composition of the National Assembly with hand-picked deputies, then dissolved it and suspended the Constitution. A new Magna Carta was drafted and approved in a referendum with 90% of the votes. This paves the way for him to have an imperial and lifelong presidency. This is how the period known as Yushin was born, which roughly translates to renewal or rejuvenation, clearly referring to the Japanese Meiji Restoration. Some scholars have even suggested that Park modeled this Fourth Republic after the Yushin, the regime of Kim Il-sung in North Korea, with whom he sought to negotiate from a position of strength. The reunification of the two Koreas. The 70s were a period of anxiety and turmoil for Park. Improvements in the standard of living bring about a growing civic awareness of political rights, which sparks significant protests. In 1972, Nixon's approach toward China led him to strengthen South Korea's military power, with the idea that he cannot even trust his closest allies to guarantee the peace and stability of his nation. In 1974, he suffered a failed assassination attempt in which his wife was killed. Naturally introverted, Park became even more isolated after that event. In 1978, he lost the legislative elections, the only adverse result he had received from the polls up to that point. However, the good economic performance did not stop. For example, heavy manufacturing exports rose by 28% per year during the decade, and real wage growth increased by almost 20%. Between 1976 and 1979, a record, within the Industrial Revolution, South Korea is fully inserted into a favorable path. Having suffered numerous attempts on his life, including an assault on the Blue House, which caused more than 30 casualties, Park Chung-Hee dies at the hands of one of his own men, Kim Hae-ju, who was the head of the South Korean intelligence agency and in charge of his security. 2 shots in an official setting, one below the ear and another in the stomach, are enough to accomplish the task. The episode, which put an end to 18 years of government, is still a subject of speculation and controversy today, especially since it cannot be framed as part of a large-scale conspiracy. Officer King, the perpetrator of the assassination who ends up being tortured and executed, would insist that he acted in accordance with his patriotic duty. Unlike other anti-communist authoritarian leaders, General Park did not see himself as a mere conservative or as a restorer of order who would revive past glories. He saw himself as the leader of a revolution, the father of a new country. He was convinced that he was the inaugurator of the greatest era in the 5,000 years since the founding of Korea. He wasn't nostalgic, but an innovator who believed that Korean history was marked by untapped potential. Before his administration, few people, except for scholars and academics, attributed a unique character to Korean society and its way of life, always living under the shadow of the Chinese and the Japanese. His supporters place him on the same level as the great modernizers of the 20th century, such as Ataturk or Lee Kuan Yew. And he has even suggested that his model served as inspiration for the reform and opening up of Deng Xiaoping, which has allowed China to lift 800 million people out of poverty. His critics, on the other hand, accuse him of having put an end to an emerging democracy in favor of repression and dictatorship. The general was a multifaceted and contradictory man. He declared himself a nationalist but made major concessions to the United States. He was trained on the left but ended up breaking away from it violently. He made it almost a taboo and relentlessly persecuted progressive dissent. He laid the foundations for a thriving liberal society, one of the few in Asia using non-liberal means. Thank you all very much for watching this video. If you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions. Like this and all our other videos and hit the bell so you get notifications for all our posts. Thank you for watching. And of course, follow us on our Instagram account where we post additional material related to everything we do on this channel. See you in the next episode and take care.